Hi, it's Ron Turpin, your host of PODigal Sons. Welcome to PODigal Sons, episode 5. PODigal Sons is a podcast in which we cover a wide range of Christian topics, as well as topics that affect humanity in general. We are also covering the Bible all the way from Genesis to Revelation. Today is the fourth installment of our Bible Companion series. So we are doing Genesis chapters 20 through 27. If you have not read those chapters yet, I would read those chapters before watching or listening to the podcast. Sorry for being out for a while. I had a number of things going on, but happy to be back with you guys and happy to jump into this. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today is going to be probably a pretty long podcast. There's a lot that happens, a lot of big topics, a lot of things that are going to be, somewhat controversial a little bit, and we're going to navigate through that. But this is going to be a good one. So let's go ahead and pick up in chapter 20. I'll go ahead and just kind of get us started by reading this first part. But Abraham journeyed on to the region of the Negeb, which will show you where that is on a map. But essentially it's like a wilderness area in the southern part of Israel, or what will become Israel. While he stayed in Gerar, he said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So we are going to see the same trick that he did with Pharaoh in chapter 12. He is going to now do to Abimelech. Abraham is about 99 years old at this point. This is happening in about 1897 BC. And we're going to get into this trick, the classic she's my sister trick, which we see several times in Genesis. So really, Abraham is flirting with danger here at this point. At any moment, Abimelech could have not only took Sarah, but slept with her or whatever, and he is becoming more and more careless with this trick that he's doing. Is he really that scared for his life? The reason he did it prior was because he was afraid that the Egyptians were going to kill him and take his wife. But in the same way, and I'm assuming he's afraid for his life, and that's why he's doing this. So one thing to consider, Abraham, he's getting pretty old. He's 99 years old. He probably, he took on kings when he was younger, and he was this warrior sort of figure. But he cannot take on an entire empire at this point. So that's one thing to consider, is he's sort of relying on his trickery rather than like his brute strength. But it's scary to think about because Sarah could have very well have been taken by this king. It's odd to think that Abraham is sort of giving up his wife. Like what was supposed to happen from there after, did he have a plan? Is he just leaving this in God's hands, possibly? And that's a question that we'll talk about, because this motive or these actions by Abraham, you sort of have to question, like, why is he doing this? Abimelech is really just a general name for the kings, and it's more of like a title. So the same way as like Pharaoh isn't really any one person's name, Abimelech is sort of the same thing. He's just, that's the title for the king of the Hittites, I'm pretty sure. But either way, they're Gentiles. They're not in the same family of God, but they're just this empire that sort of runs a large territory in and around the area that Abraham is living in, the land that God has promised them. So that's why he's sort of yielding to Abimelech here. And so God goes to Abimelech in a dream and tells him very seriously that he will die if he takes Abraham. So God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman you have taken, for she has a husband." Abimelech, who had not approached her, said, "O Lord, would you slay a man even though he is innocent?" So Abimelech is allowed by God to state his case because it's a valid question. I mean, he hasn't really done anything wrong to his knowledge. For all he knows, this is Abraham's sister, as he was told by Abraham. Um, but God answers and shows, his reason for this. Um, so Abimelech says, he himself told me she is my sister, and she herself also stated this, saying, Sarah also said that she was Abraham's sister. He is my brother. I did it in good faith and with clean hands. God answered him in the dream. Yes, I know you did it in good faith. In fact, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Therefore, return the man's wife. As a spokesman, he will intercede for you that your life may be saved. If you do not return her, you can be sure that you and all who are yours will certainly die. So it's a very serious thing here that's happening, and God is doing this in the most peaceful way possible by coming to him in a dream. And many times God will do things in a very peaceful way that gets the point across without causing any death or bodily harm, and that's why he's using a dream here. He's ordered to return her, and this is just a very serious thing. So one thing that I couldn't help but question is a lot of scholars, reading this, or really, I guess, any theologian or whoever, whatever, most people that read this are sort of reading this, and Abraham is looked at as lacking faith in these matters. But the more and more I think about how this is happening, I kind of can't help but question, is Abraham's second use of this she's my sister trick actually a show of faith by Abraham? He's doing this this is a cunning sort of thing that happens where he doesn't necessarily trust these people, and by just saying, this is my wife, Abraham is under the impression that if he tells these whoever it is, Abimelech's men or anybody that he encounters out of this empire, that they're just going to kill him and take her. He really feels like deep down that would happen. And I can't help but think maybe that would happen. So the question of, is this actually a show of faith? Well, the answer would be, of course not. I mean, the conventional answer would be, of course not, because it's understood here that Abraham, should not be putting his wife or his bloodline in danger. And it actually, supposedly shows a lack of faith in God. And I understand that point of view, but if that is the case, why, when this happens, does Abraham get repeatedly blessed? Not only with material possessions, which we'll find out in a second, but he also gets blessed with Isaac shortly after this, the birth of Isaac. And God doesn't really seem to correct this behavior. So it's just something that I've been thinking about. And it's sort of a unique perspective that I wanted to sort of bring out. And really ultimately, what if Abraham truly did believe that his life was in danger and that God would protect him, just as the first time that this happened? So Abraham sees this trick work, and he sees that God helped and basically protected him and Sarah in the first occurrence. So doing this a second time, did he perhaps know that things were going to turn out okay in the end? I think that that's possible. But I'm not honestly sure. Obviously, nobody. Um, I've never heard any of this discussed by anybody or have heard that perspective before. So there's smarter Christians than me that I would probably have to just lean on and say, you know, that's not what's really happening. And I definitely think, it's wrong for Abraham to give his wife to another man. It could have went the complete opposite way, and Sarah could have, you know, been sort of forced to sleep with Abimelech. So it's a touchy subject, and it's something for me to question. I guess that's fine. We can all question these things, but ultimately, these are just questions, and this is why I do the podcast, because I think this stuff is fun and it's cool to talk about. But it's just a theory that I have, that I feel like Abraham just kind of sort of knew, like, hey, God's got me, and I'm going to put it in God's hands and leave it up to that chance, rather than trying to defeat these people one-on-one in a battle, or one on 100, or however many they were in this empire. So I'm just curious as to a possible different angle to Abraham's actions. But I'm looking for others for opinion. So if you ever want to discuss that, feel free to hit me up. Abraham is asked by Abimelech, why are you doing this? I could have died. After this dream happened, Abimelech called Abraham and basically is like, how could you do this to us? What wrong did I do to you that you should have brought such monstrous guilt on me and my kingdom? You have treated me in an intolerable way. So Abimelech's pretty mad, and Abimelech is quite is showing that he fears God right here. And Abraham is, responds and is like, I don't see God in this place, and I didn't have it. I would figured you guys were going to, you know, kill me. So that is revealed here, that was his motive, was because he was afraid for his life. I was afraid, answered Abraham, because I thought there would surely be no fear of God in this place, and so they would kill me on account of my wife. Besides, she's in truth my sister, but only my father's daughter, not my mother's. So she's like a half sort of sister, I guess. So he's only like half lying. So that's, he's kind of leaning on that as well. And we come to find out that this is something that could have went wrong, but it ends up working out in the end. But Abraham was very much wrong to assume that there was no fear of God in the place, because there obviously was. Abimelech was, scared to death of this interaction that he had with God, and he was very much afraid. So Abraham is definitely coming at a place of having these preconceived notions of these people that were wrong. But Abraham gets blessed again here. And I'll just kind of finish that part of it. But when God sent me wandering from my father's house, I asked her, would you do me this favor? In whatever place that we come to, say that I am your brother. And then Abimelech took flocks, herds, and servants and gave them to Abraham. And he even gave him 1,000 shekels of silver. So we'll talk about that, because that's a lot of material possessions to give him. So this blessing that we see it kind of somewhat backs my sort of perspective that maybe this was a show of faith by Abraham. Abraham shows a defining fear in God here, Abimelech is showing a defining fear of God in this by righting this wrong. It's not just that Abimelech was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't know and I'm so sorry, please get out. It's like, no, he's trying to make sure that it's all good, and he's trying to give Abraham all these possessions. And this is why it's important that we recognize that Gentiles, people that are not of the lineage of the Israelites, this is why it's important to recognize them and that they can be welcomed back into the family of God through Christ, because many times they exhibit more faith in God than the Israelites or the Jewish people did. So it is interesting here, this fear of God that Abimelech has. We'll pick up in verse 14. We already kind of discussed that, but here's my... so after he gives him all the animals and the servants, after he restored his wife Sarah to him, he said, here, my land lies at your disposal. Settle wherever you please. So he's even letting him use the land along with all these other things. To Sarah, he said, see, I have given your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. Let that serve you as a vindication before all who are with you. Your honor has been preserved with everyone. So now nobody questions that she ever did anything with one of the kings. It's all been made right. So 1,000 shekels, that is a lot. I did some sort of calculations, and that's about 20 to 25 pounds of silver. And if you looked at modern day, that's about 480. It's about, silver probably goes for about $480 per pound, which is about $10,000 just in the silver value. But in the ancient times, silver had a different monetary value than we sort of think of silver. So it could have been worth, I don't know, probably anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 or something of just silver. So he is really giving Abraham a lot here. Those are just sort of rough estimates, but I just put that together to kind of have an understanding of how much 1,000 shekels is. There was also, animals and servants. So, and it actually uses slaves, and we're going to talk about that. I haven't brought that up yet. We're about 20 chapters into Genesis, and we have not talked about slavery. So I'm going to pause and sort of talk about the Bible and slavery, because this is a pretty highly discussed subject amongst skeptics and people who criticize the Bible, that there's a lot of slavery in it. But it's really a different world, and it's a different type of slavery, and we really need to talk about it. And really the first mention of it was Noah sort of casting this curse and basically saying that Canaan would have to serve all of his other brothers, and the line of Canaan would have to serve all these forever, and there would be this long-lasting servitude installed via this curse. But that's Noah doing this. And remember, Noah was drunk when he did this. So, or I'm assuming he's drunk, but he was in a drunken state. We don't follow Noah. Noah is not the end all be all at all. Like, it is, and people, just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean that we should live like that, or we should follow in the footsteps of Noah. There's other things that there's all kind of people that we look at in the Bible that are flawed, and it doesn't have any implication that is God's doing. So God did not do this. After the ark landed, Noah indulged in this drunken lifestyle that He sort of lived for himself. And you got to kind of think about, he achieved something that was really like unthinkable. Having been the only, having this, being a major patriarch that survived, this big flood in which everybody died. So after that, he got lost in his drunkenness. I kind of think about it in the same way, almost like a movie star, or something. After they hit it big, or after they accomplish this thing, they indulge, because they're sort of celebrating in their, and they don't really have any other way of, if they're not 100% focused, they can become very comfortable. He doesn't have to go battle for resources anymore, like there's no competition. So anytime you have, it's like, if you get the opportunity, you might indulge in that opportunity. And I think that's what happened. But it's just another example of why we don't follow Noah, and it's why Christ is so important, because he is the figure that comes that we do follow. And so this thing that he does with this curse, and sort of cursing an entire line of people to be servants, and it's sort of first introduced there, but we see the Egyptians is, this concept of having servants and having people that are working exclusively for the, working 100% exclusively for the benefit of somebody else, which is just a fancy way of saying slavery. But this concept starts evolving and by men, and we're seeing this being used by the Egyptians and really all of the other cultures. And what it really is you got to think too about the control over food and water, that sort of naturally allows these people to lord over other people. This is why the control of the wells was so important. The water wells, and this search for, actual water, which was the reason why a lot of people were subjugated, is they were, they had to get water, so they would do whatever they needed to under the person who controlled the water. Well, it's an evil behavior to do that, to take advantage of God's creation, to try to take advantage of a well of water, and that's why Jesus comes in, and he is the answer, because he is the living water. And it's interesting that there's a parallel there that is discussed in the New Testament, with the woman at the well, and just many other examples. But so God hasn't instituted any type of slavery here. This has been purely a production of man, and it's now being introduced by a Gentile to Abraham in these gifts that Abimelech is giving Abraham, in these servants. And as we find out, like in the Old Testament, the slavery is just way different than we think of slavery, from the more recent slavery that was ended in the 1800s. It's not a race-based slavery. In a lot of ways, it was a servitude that people sort of willingly went into in order to make sure that they had food and water. We'll see that happening. So there's, we're going to talk about it probably more, but I just want to sort of set that understanding that it's not the same type of slavery that we think about. And there is a huge thing going on with this control aspect of the world, in which somebody is controlling a group of people, or everyone in the everyone that lives under them, and they're sort of lording over everyone. It's not just that they have slaves, but every single other person is living in essence to serve this king or this pharaoh or something. And as we find out a lot, with the Israelites and with the early patriarchs, they had deep relationships with slaves and with slave women, and in different cases. So it's different. It's not like they're just existing to serve them and nothing else. No, they're very much a part of the family, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they are slaves in a physical sense. It really almost just means that they're not the one in control. So control was a huge concept in this ancient world, and it's why slavery is almost a part of evolution in a way, in that it's a way of survival for people that didn't have access to water. And it's an evil concept that people in power will institute and create for themselves. It's the same thing with the strongest survive, and it's a part of taking advantage of that power. But God is not institute. If anything, Christ comes in and says, "The greatest among you will serve the other." So what does that mean? So that basically is saying that the servant is going to have more favor with God than the person who is sort of putting their legs up and having everybody serve them. So the New Testament comes in and completely rewrites that. But this whole slavery issue that we have, that a lot of people do have with the Bible, is going to be something that I want to talk about, and that's what this podcast is for. But in this chapter, Abimelech is gifting these slaves to Abraham, and it's not a good thing. But we have to put ourselves in this world, and we have to understand that these people are not being like abused in the same way that a lot of the 18th century or prior like slaves were. They're sort of living in this family with them. It's just that they are made to serve Abraham as their leader. So we have to do our best to put ourselves back 3,500 years ago in this world. So at this point, Sarah's been vindicated. Also, Abimelech's wife and all the females in his household have been cured. After he showed a fear of God, Abraham then interceded with God, and God restored health to Abimelech. So it all rights itself. All the wrongs right itself, and God had control of their wombs, basically controlling their reproduction. As soon as Sarah walks in the door, God does this. He's basically, he's gonna himself make sure that nothing happens to Sarah. So he puts these, like he did with the Egyptians, he put a plague with the Egyptians, and now he's controlling all of the women. That when Sarah comes in, it's like, okay, all of the women now can't reproduce. Sarah's protected by God, and also God knows here that Abraham and Sarah are old. And so for them to even be in this situation, it is fragile. And I think after this happens, after this whole chapter 20 scenario, this thing with Abimelech and the whole she's my sister trick, I think God is like, okay, this is getting to be long enough, because Abraham is old. He's been faithful to Sarah for so many years, and he still doesn't have a son with her. It could be another reason why maybe Abraham's okay, or was okay with just leaving it up for chance with what happens with Sarah. I know that's tough to say, but it is just the reality of this. Abraham, he's been faithful for a long time. It's only natural for Abraham to want to heir. So I'm sure this has been hard on both of them, and God is showing grace here by making things right with Abimelech and with Abraham. These Bible characters, are very relatable for it being so long ago, and it shows the ups and downs of faith in a way that no other book or no other religion will really exemplify. So we're done with chapter 20. We're moving on to chapter 21. The Lord, after this happened, I think he's like, let's do this now. The Lord remembers his promise that he made with Sarah, and God always comes through on his promises. It might take a very long time, but God does come through. And I'm sure this was, jaw-dropping news, but Sarah becomes pregnant with Isaac. And I'm sure it was probably the gossip of the town. And even this day, it's still talked about, by many and referenced, that you don't stop praying no matter what. In the case of somebody who's struggling to conceive and have a child, personally, there's instances where, we prayed for 5 years for someone to have a baby, and they did. And it's just great news when you hear that, when you hear the success of prayer and faith. And God's ready to deliver after that whole debacle. I think that was the thing that the straw that finally kind of broke the camel's back, I guess. But Abraham has now more money than ever. This is a great setup. Now he has all these people to help, and these money and all these resources. Isaac represents, the supernatural, the rebirth of all of us in Christ, which, is a miracle. It's a parallel there, in that you have Isaac, the supernatural birth, and you have the supernatural birth of, or rebirth of all of us, which, I have to shout out again to Pastor Paul, but from Calvary Chapel, which I watch a lot of his videos in preparation for these. I agree with a lot of what he says, but I kind of picked up that parallel from him, and this birth is definitely supernatural, to say the least. So Isaac was 8 days old when he was circumcised. Sarah says here, God had given me a cause to laugh, and all who hear of it will laugh with me. Who would have told Abraham, she added, that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Isaac grew, and on the day of the child's weaning, Abraham held a great feast. So typically they were a little bit older when they stopped weaning in that time. Probably maybe Isaac was like 2 or 3 when they have this big feast, and it was a big deal, this thing that, having this child be sort of independent in some way. So they're having this big feast. But we're about to get back into some muddy waters here. So Sarah does not like the situation with Hagar. And is it fair? Is this fair for Sarah to feel this way? Probably not really, because, she's the one who sort of gave Abraham this idea to even, bring her into the family to begin with. But who's in charge? Ultimately, they can make that. Sarah can make that call, and honestly, Sarah probably knows that moving forward, it's not going to work anyways. So she's just ready to be done. So, she noticed that So Sarah noticed the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham playing with her son Isaac. So she demanded of Abraham, drive out that slave and her son. Um, that's harsh to hear, but no son of that slave is going to share the inheritance with my son Isaac. Abraham was greatly distressed, especially on account of his son Ishmael. So, this is a bad situation for really all of them, and it's why this situation is not the nuclear family, right? You have essentially two wives trying to live under the same roof, and we see cultures still trying to do this. Religion still trying to do this, and the entire Islamic religion born out of this side of Abraham is going to sort of institute that into their religion. But I mean, if you just think about that setup, it's going to be a much more toxic, unhealthy, somewhat really deadly situation that just creates a lot of natural tension. Like, you're going to have a lot of jealousy when you have, two wives and one husband trying to compete for the attention and the resources of that husband. Sorry, I just need to make sure okay. But I mean, obviously that's just not it's not the best setup biologically or spiritually. And it's why it's not God's design. And it's just an obvious reason why, when picking a religion, why Christ is just the obvious path to follow. So there's this tension that exists between Sarah and Hagar. God's design for marriage is sacred, and it's one that one husband and one wife just provides like a harmonious relationship between them. And it goes against the sort of naturalistic evolutionary drive out of the strongest surviving. And without God, we revert back to that. But ultimately, that is a sinful way that harbors jealousy and immorality and murder and many other unholy behaviors are going to come out of that. We could probably find statistics, but I'm sure a lot of murders happen because of some infidelity or something happening like that. There's one. So now we have two different lines of Abraham. We have Isaac and we have Ishmael. One is representing the son of promise, Isaac. This is another interpretation I've heard. And then Ishmael is representing the son of flesh. So you have you're putting all your faith in God, and then you're sort of making your own lineage. You're sort of doing it on your own. And that's what Ishmael sort of represents here. And this is, we see a lot of this today, not just with multiple wives, but the Christian ethics and the son of promise and sons of promise with Christ and the promise of his kingdom, which is what you have in Isaac, versus the promise of flesh. So it's a it's a parallel, or it's two different worlds here that are created, but it is an interesting concept that we're seeing right now in chapter 21, the beginning of two different lines. Sarah was very harsh with her words with Hagar, but this is a very human response. They were both Egyptian. They don't even have they don't have the 10 Commandments yet, much less they don't have Christ guiding them on how to act and be to their neighbors or their family members or whoever. But God pretty much says, "Don't worry," to Hagar. He's still going to have her back, um, and he comes through for her because he understands her situation, and that she was wronged. Really, Hagar, you can't blame Hagar for a lot of this. She just sort of went along with what they were sort of scheming, and he makes it right. Really, really, interesting that we think of Abraham, or we think of God coming in to this situation and making it good for Hagar and sort of correcting these words of Sarah that are putting her down as this slave woman. God is really going to come through right here, and it's sort of a slap back at slavery, I would say. They were these two. I feel bad too. Another thing is I feel bad for this, Ishmael and Isaac. They are two brothers. They probably weren't born too far apart either. But one second, guys. So yeah, they're having Isaac and Ishmael be two brothers that are sort of split apart. That's also a sad thing to think about. But anyway, so um, she's left. Abraham gives them a little bit of food and sort of has to just send them on his way. I'm sure he was. It's a sad moment here, to think about, but. They're roaming endlessly in Beersheba, is what it says. We'll show that on a map. And all the water that Abraham had given them gets used up pretty quick. So, and life can hit real quick when you lose the support of a provider. And this is another concept to that whole the slavery thing that we're thinking about. Like, well, in that day, you had to depend on somebody, more than likely, in order to survive. A lot of people did, for their water or their food or something. So that's why this is sort of getting revealed here. A man who controls the source of the food or the water is going to have control. But anyway, so they're wandering aimlessly. They don't have anything. And so she put the child down under a shrub, and sat a ways away from him. A bow shot, I guess, is about as far as you can shoot a bow, maybe 100 yards or so. Football field length, maybe. So she didn't want to watch him die, and I guess that's why you have to. It says it in the Bible. Let me not watch to see the child die. I'm sure she didn't want to see that. And he began to cry, and God heard his voice. God heard the boy's cry, and God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven, "What is the matter, Hagar?" So if God was this person that just didn't watch out for his people that were slaves, or he didn't have to answer anything to Hagar. Remember, this is not, God didn't formulate this plan to get Hagar pregnant. It had nothing to do with God. God is really adopting Ishmael here. And it's just an interesting thing that God is showing his compassion and his love, and people don't pull that out of the Old Testament. All they think about is, well, there's slavery in the Old Testament, so God must love slavery, and it's just so not the case. But so it says she was blinded by this appearance almost of God, and in the same way that we had that light from in Sodom with the angels, it could have been sort of the same thing. But I'll just go ahead and read it because it's really cool, this part. "What is the matter, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cry, and this plight of his Arise, lift up the boy and hold him by hand, for I will make of him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went in and filled the skin with water and let the boy drink. So it's God, and I guess I'll just finish it. But God was with the boy as he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert bowman with his home in the wilderness of Paran. His mother got a wife for him on the land from the land of Egypt. So it's really cool that a well of water was produced right in front of her eyes. This source of water, like I've been saying, like these water was a big deal, and to have that is just something really, really cool. God comes through for these people. Won't he do it? Because he really will. But he grew up, and I just gotta say, man, like this whole thing with Ishmael, it kind of touches a place in my heart, because I see the Muslim religion, and they recognize Christ as a prophet and not necessarily the Messiah. I don't know. I'd have to do a whole thing on that to try to understand that. But in some ways, they're closer to Christianity than a lot of people really. I think that a lot of people kind of overlook that they are sort of close to Christianity. There's obviously a lot of issues with the Islamic religion, but you do have to look at them as part of God's people, and they're closer to Christ than probably modern Jewish people are. But either way, I have a sort of a soft spot for Ishmael here, getting sort of thrown out of this thing, and God still having their back. It shows a lot to me. So let's get back to Abraham. Abimelech wants to make a deal with Abraham so that's why we're getting into this pact at Beersheba. Abimelech wants to make this deal with Abraham now that they will not. So they don't want any. He doesn't want any more false dealings. No more shenanigans. Abraham is pretty much what Abimelech is saying here, and Abraham's like, I swear, bro, I'm not going to do that anymore. But since you brought it up, I do have to talk about this well. So Abraham, has to bring this up now. Since Abimelech's trying to make peace, Abraham's like, well, there's something we need to talk about. And it is this well that had been seized by force by Abimelech's men. So, yes, this is a thing. Like I mentioned, controlling water was a big thing. And the Lord will provide water as living water, but in this time, it was like whoever controlled the water was acting as a lord over all the other people. And that's why, God, when Jesus says, I am the living water, like he is going to supersede all this power and control over this physical water. And it's going to override that. And that's just a very powerful thing that I think some people might miss, that whole concept of water and the dependency on water. And really, we are dependent on Christ and the living water, not physical water. And so Abraham's like, well, what about this well that you guys, stole from me? And Abimelech's like, I'm just finding out about this right now, is pretty much what he says here. It's very possible. I mean, he controlled this entire region. He doesn't know what's going on. I was a manager of a store for a while, and there were things like customers would come in, and it's like I had no idea about that. I mean, it's very possible that he didn't know what was going on in that dealing in which one of his men took, or some of his men took, Abraham's well. So he's not, Abimelech's in this position. He's not going to be updated in these bad faith dealings that happen. But they make Abimelech's like, sorry about that. Um, you know, I want to make this right. Well, I guess he doesn't really say that, but Abraham just assumes that. We'll just read it so we can clarify. So Abraham, however, approached Abimelech about a well that Abimelech's men had seized by force. I have no idea who did that, Abimelech replied. In fact, you never told me about it, nor did I hear about it until just now. Then Abraham took sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two made a pact. So Abimelech wasn't like, oh, I'm sorry. Abraham just kind of took it upon himself to have a show of faith, to make to continue the peacemaking. But they come into an agreement, and there's this exchange of these 7 ewe lamb, which is like female lambs. It's interesting that a lamb is used here, because that is a continual thing. A lamb in the Bible is sort of a symbol of its symbology of Christ almost. And then also there's 7 of these, and the 7 is a continual repeating number, part of this biblical numerology that we look through, and we'll see several different numbers. So it's interesting that there's 7 lambs. They're female. We probably could try to look into the meaning of that, but either way, he lived peaceably and comfortably in this territory with Abimelech, this land of the Philistines. Abimelech is going to have this peaceful reconciliation here with Abraham. And Abraham prayed to God and planted a tamarisk tree, which symbolizes like generations to come, but that comes from the reason it symbolizes that is because it comes from Abraham here planting it. So it's just a nice peaceful moment, and kind of just when everything is like we see, once we get to some peaceful moment, or everything seems like it's good, we're about to be back into a sticky situation. So, all right. Chapter 22, one of the most highly discussed chapters in the Bible by far. I would say one of the most highly discussed chapters in the Old Testament by far. So let's go ahead and just read this, because it's actually a short chapter, but we're going to be talking about it for a while. So chapter 22, the testing of Abraham. Sometime after these events, God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, Abraham, ready? He replied. Then God said, take your son Isaac, your only one, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him up as a holocaust on a height that I will point out to you. So this is, why is this being asked of Abraham here? I mean, he's supposed to be the promised son, and real quick, I mean, it's his only son. Number one, it's his only son right now, and it's his only son with his wife Sarah. So it's the only heir that he has at this time. So it's his only son. But it's important before we get into this, God does not condone child sacrifice or human sacrifice in any way. And that we understand this throughout the Bible, but we understanding that, why would he ask this of Abraham? And it's his only son, the son of promise that God promised was, this is a promise by God. So why would he take it away? So let's dive into that. I mean, we know that God doesn't put up with child sacrifice, and it's actually a huge theme that will pop up in the Old Testament. Leviticus chapter 20 through verse 1 through 5. It'll talk about Moloch and the in God's condemning any child sacrifices, and it's a terrible sin. So we know that God doesn't put up with this. And we have to understand that people at this time were doing this, and it was very normal. But God is not like those other gods. People were doing this to sacrifice their sons and daughters to these other gods, but God is not like these other gods, and He's better. So why is this something that He is going to require from Abraham? We need a further understanding of why He's doing this. And one thing I want to talk about is God has a higher purpose for His actions. There are things that God will do that He can command and do things that on the surface level seem very questionable, but when you actually dive into it, underneath that surface level understanding, there's much bigger implications and things that reveal themselves, especially once everything plays out and it's completed. So people will always take a passage or even one thing out of the Bible, and they'll try to make God look like whatever they're trying to make God look like. You just can't do that. I mean, number one, you don't know how it ends, or if you do know, you're just ignoring that. But ultimately, there's other things going on. So, and it's lessons, things that people will use for years to come based on one action. So on the surface, seems like we don't hard to really understand what it is, but if you just take it at face value, but there's a higher purpose to His plan, and we can learn to have faith and not question His actions or commands. But it's tough to do that. I would say for a lot of people it is, for sure. But these lessons and things, once they happen, then we learn from that, and we don't really have to go through. We're never going to be asked to do that, and especially after the new covenant with Christ, we're never going to be asked to sacrifice our son, or daughter, or whatever. But we think about other things that He did to serve a purpose and to serve a lesson that we learn from. Like flooding the earth was purposeful, not just that the action of ridding evil, but it's also the lesson it provided and the precedent it sort of set in the world. Sarah being barren for so many years, that created a story that showed that through faith, through God, all things were possible. And I'm sure there's a lot of women who, struggling to conceive, have read that and have learned to have faith in God. So even though it was tough for Sarah to go through that, the reason it happened, it could be the lesson that we learn from it. Allowing His people to become slaves in Egypt. Like, why does God have to allow that? Well, that whole story, the way it plays out, it shows God's true dominance in this world and His ability to deliver us from our bondage as well. And then ultimately, the big thing here is the sacrifice of His son. That is, and this time it's for real. Whenever God sacrifices His son, Jesus Christ, it's not a, it's not a game. It really does happen. And God and Christ goes through these terrible, torturous punishments unjustly. And it serves as a symbol to all that we are welcome into the kingdom. And it serves as just this great, sacrifice that is made of peace and love that He has for us, instead of being vengeful and which He easily could have been. And it's setting an example that we are to follow. And So he has purpose behind his action. God, if he's doing something, then there's a reason. But he, provided this sacrifice he's not asking this of us. He doesn't. He's asking this of Abraham, but he doesn't ask him to actually do it. And we'll read about that. I know I'm skipping forward, but you have to sort of address this question of why is this being asked of Abraham. And that's the ultimate lesson in this story is that stems from this big ask of God to Abraham. I mean, anybody reading this and can't see the parallel between what God is asking of Abraham here and what he eventually will do himself. I mean, that's just such an obvious revelation there. But billions of people are going to look at this story. I mean, billions of Christians and really, Jewish people are going to look at this story and they're going to see and they're going to be inspired to have faith and trust in the Lord our God from this one thing that Abraham is asking, or that one thing that God is asking of Abraham. So that's why I think this is happening is to set is to show is really for the story and the lessons that we learn from it. But God is testing Abraham. I mean, God wants to know if Abraham really truly loves him. But okay, one question, we have way more to talk about on this, but I mean, I gotta gonna go through this question is, what would you do if you were in Abraham's shoes? I think a lot of when you read this, you sort of put yourself like, could I do that? Because I think most people, their natural inclination is absolutely not. They're not going to sacrifice their son. A lot of people would have problems sacrificing their dogs or whoever or whatever. There's people that won't sacrifice TV for God. I mean, so it's a tough question, and I think it's much easier to theorize this than to actually answer. One thing that we have to consider is we can't help but give a biased answer here because we already read the story and we know what happens. We know this happier conclusion that happens with Isaac. So, not to mention the external context with the Messiah and everything. So any answer we give is going to be completely biased. Anybody that's like, yeah, I would definitely do that. Well, I mean, you might definitely do it because but if I had to put myself in the shoes of somebody who hasn't heard of our God, and I mean, I would probably definitely assume I would say no, because just logically, it just wouldn't be something that I would want to do. And I wouldn't care who's asking me to do it. But let's think about if we're living in Abraham's shoes, because that is the question, right? So we're living in Abraham's shoes, and we have this relationship with God, and this relationship is much more tangible, and it's a much more physical relationship with God than we would have spiritually with the Holy Spirit. Abraham has this like physical being that he's seeing, and he's seeing all these wonders, and he's seeing what happened with this promise to Sarah. So he is understanding that. I think it would be a lot easier for me to say yes, having this come from this command come from a physical being. And I don't know if I would say yes, really. Like, I would probably give an unexcited sure. But it's a completely biased answer, and any answer we give isn't going to be, it's not going to be a fair thing as far as how we would interpret that question, because, like, again, we've already know what happens. But I would say yes, because I know that the God I follow is righteous and true, and he has my best interest at heart. In the same way Abraham, saw that and saw firsthand that God was doing things for him and his line, and that God was going to be there for him. So, Abraham, and this whole thing with Abraham and God and this relationship, I mean, Abraham didn't waste any time after he was asked this. He got all of his stuff and he's ready to go. I would, pausing here again, I would highly recommend watching the movie. I talked about this on the last podcast. I would watch the movie His Only Son. It's a really good movie, and it's going to help to understand, I think, the time that they were living in, and what this whole kind of, how this whole dynamic might have lived, or how it might have looked like. But anyway, so the third day, so he asked them to leave, and he takes some servants, and they take everything that they need. And on the third day of travel, Abraham sees the mountain where the sacrifice is to take place, and he tells his servants to stay while he brings Isaac up there. Isaac asks in verse 7, as the two walked on together, Isaac spoke to his father. Father, he said. Yes, son, he replied. Isaac continued, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the holocaust? Son, Abraham answered, God himself will provide the sheep for the holocaust. That's just, so basically saying God himself will provide the sacrifice. That is very prophetic, to say the least. God didn't ask us to sacrifice our own, God, whenever he asks a sacrifice of anybody, it's of himself. It's of his son. And so that's interesting. It's just so interesting that this little conversation here, it's such a parallel to Christ. So Abraham built an altar. He put the wood on top. This was supposed to be a burnt offering. So not only is he supposed to slaughter the offering, but he's also gonna burn it. And then Abraham takes out this knife, and in a very dramatic fashion, God calls down on him at the last minute, do not lay your hand on the boy. Wow, it is, I know everybody knows this story, but reading it and talking about it has a lot of emotions built into it. And Abraham is exhibiting a great love of God here, and God comes through again for Abraham, and Abraham is doing the same thing that God will eventually do. So he has the character that God is looking for, a complete willingness to follow him no matter what. And God provided, the sacrifice, which was the ram. Abraham looked about, he spied a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he went and took the ram and offered it up as a holocaust in place of his son. So this parallel cannot be denied. There's an obvious connection with Christ in that God provided the sacrifice. God can certainly test people. There's nothing wrong with God testing people, like here in this, and people are like so worried, like, oh my gosh, God asked, it was a test. It wasn't even there. He came in and he knew that Abraham wasn't going to actually kill his son. But there's many verses that will, Psalm 11:5, Proverbs 17:3. We'll go ahead and pull those up, but there's many verses that are going to point to God testing people. Another interesting concept of this whole thing of testing, this is going to provide a link to the simulation theory that I discussed in the first episode. in which we're living for the next life. So whatever happens in this life, it doesn't matter anyways. I mean, it matters, and I'm not saying that, but I'm saying the outcomes of life and death, and we sort of hold on to everything that we acquire in this world. Well, it doesn't matter, because ultimately we're living to get into the kingdom of heaven, and God is using this life to sort of test us and see if we're holy enough to live in his presence in the kingdom of heaven. And that's where in the first video, when I made that connection, that a lot of modern sort of intellectual people are sort of looking at this whole simulation theory. I made a connection with, not necessarily the simulation theory that they're talking about, but a simulation of our hearts and our will, and living that out, in order to see, if we can actually live in next to him. It would make more sense probably if you go watch that first video, but I will say that I think that God testing people is just a very it's a continual thing, but it's just an interesting thing that him testing people is an interesting thing that ties the whole simulation theory together. In the end, God showed compassion, and he differentiates himself from these other gods that existed, and that he ultimately didn't ask Abraham to do this, to go through with it. And these other gods, that wasn't the case. These people were actually doing it. So some people have this issue with God doing this here, but he didn't. Nothing happened. There's a standard that this is never going to happen again. God would never ask of this. It's in Leviticus, like I said, 20, chapter 21-5. Very much against human sacrifice. There's a reference to this in Hebrews, chapter 11, 17-19. Abraham had so much faith that, and there's kind of, the writer of Hebrews is making this assertion that Abraham, he probably thought that God could just raise him from. That's how much Abraham had seen. That Abraham was the whole point, never questioning. You don't see Abraham going back and forth with God on this. Abraham was going back and forth with God about Sodom and destroying Sodom. He was more worried about that than he was about his own son. So it just really shows a faith in Abraham. And that's why the whole, like, she's my sister thing, I just don't see how Abraham could be so afraid and unfaithful in God in that scenario. But then right here, he's just the most faith in God. I think he had faith in God the whole time. And that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. Okay. So Abraham named the site Yahweh Yiri. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but sounds good, I think. On the mountain the Lord will see, is what that means. And this whole mountain where this happened, it's interesting that God had asked Abraham to travel for the 3 days, because it's like 50 miles. Why couldn't he just do it, a mile down the road? Probably so that Sarah couldn't see or something, but she would have been freaking out. But 50 miles away, because it's the same mountainscape where Christ is crucified. It's near the exact same mountain. You have Mount Moriah, where this is happening with Isaac, and then you have Golgotha, which is where Christ was crucified. So it's interesting that this is happening like almost in the same spot. And so Lord's messenger calls to Abraham from heaven. I swear, let me just pick that up. The Lord's messenger called Abraham from heaven and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you acted as you did in withholding and not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the sky. So really, all these promises are just more concrete now. Like all these things that God had promised, if it were possible that they would be more promised, I guess, like now they are even more promised. Abraham went back with his servants to Beersheba. But looking back, I mean, this was a tough thing for God to ask of Abraham. It wasn't like God at the beginning of it was like, don't worry, Abraham, it's going to be fine. Just play along. Like, no, I mean, this whole time, Abraham really did think that he was going to have to kill his son. So it's great that it worked out in the end, but it's a stressful thing. I'm kind of relieved that this chapter is done because, I mean, it took a lot of understanding for me to really be able to talk about it. But there's a brief thing about Nahor's descendants, Abraham's brother Nahor and Uz, amongst others. Bethuel, who is important, is the father of Rebekah, who is going to be the wife to Isaac. So that's important to track. All right, we're done with chapter 22. Moving on to chapter 23. So Sarah dies at the age of 127 in Hebron. Abraham performed the customary rites. He needs to go to the Hittites to ask permission because they controlled the land where he wanted to bury his wife, which was the land promised in the covenant. And so he asked the Hittites this, and they're like, absolutely, please do. They have a lot of respect for Abraham. They say, you are an elect of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial sites. None of us would deny you his burial ground for the burial of your dead. So Abraham asked them to intercede for him to go get Ephron, who is like the person running this exact plot of land. And he needs to, he's like, okay, since y'all are okay with it, can you go get Ephron and ask if he can sell the cave to him, the cave of Machpelah on the edge of this field at full price. He wants to pay full price in front of them as witnesses, so nobody can say, oh, I don't remember that, Abraham. What are you talking about? No, he needs everybody to see this. So Ephron came out. He says, yes, please, you can have it as a gift. And Abraham's like, no. He's like, I want to pay for the field. Why does Abraham want to pay for this field? Ephron's like, okay, sure, it's 400 shekels then of silver. What is it to me if you bury your wife? And kind of researching into it, 400 shekels is like way more than than probably the actual value of the land should have been. But Ephron's probably thinking Abraham's going to haggle him down here. But why doesn't Abraham just sort of accept their word for it? And there's many different reasons for this. Number one, he wants to make it official so that it can't come back and haunt him later. So really, he's trying to make this as official as possible. He doesn't want the land to be desecrated. But by owning it, it helps ensure that this will not happen. This is a burial site. He doesn't want people just doing whatever on it. So he needs to own the land to make sure that doesn't happen. He doesn't want to feel like he owes the Hittites something. That's important. So that's exactly how he dealt with the king of Sodom. When king of Sodom tried to give him stuff, he was like, no, I don't want to owe you anything. He doesn't want Ephron's men to come back on their word or to mess with him while he's praying there. while he's burying his wife. And Abraham has this like covenant type approach with this transaction, which I think he's kind of picking that up from God. And it's like we can say everything that we want, but God is showing action in multiple different ways, like we saw with the animal sacrifice, and then with him actually delivering Isaac and all these different things that God has actually done. So he needs it to be official, and Abraham is expanding his lineage. So he doesn't need to just do it for now. He needs to do it. He needs to have it be there for forever. So he needs to own the land for forever. So it also has future implications for the land that was promised by God, really. So this is why it makes sense that, and it is important to Abraham, but it's not really important to Ephron. And Abraham has no problem paying the 400 shekels. He's like, yeah, it's totally fine. So the cave and all the trees within its limits was purchased in the presence of the Hittites. I learned that Ephron might have been throwing in more land to sort of get out of taxes, which we kind of know that from studying the Hittite Empire and how their dealings sort of went. So Abraham successfully buys this, and he buries Sarah there. All right, so that's chapter 23. Now we get into chapter 24. Abraham is now getting old and ripe in his age. So he tells his servant, his senior servant, put your hand under my thigh. Seems like weird, but it's under my thigh, I guess, like right by the knee. This is a symbolic gesture. I kind of looked into like what's the whole hand on the knee, the thigh thing. The symbolic gesture implied that the oath taker would be at the mercy of Abraham's descendants if he did not fulfill his end of the bargain. So that's why that hand, I guess, goes there. But he pretty much makes the servant swear that he's going to do it. I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of earth. And here is what he's asking, that you will not procure a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but that you will go to my own land and to my kindred to get a wife for my son Isaac. So this whole thing that he's asking him to swear here is that he's going to be able to go find him a wife of the lineage that Abraham wants. And the servant asks, what if she is unwilling to follow me? Should I take him back to the land which you migrated, meaning like the land where they follow other gods that like Abraham and Sarah had came from? And Abraham's like, no, never take my son back there for any reason. So don't do that. God made a promise for this land, not the other land. And so this is important that the servant understand this. Abraham conveys it again in verse 7. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and the land of my kin, and who confirmed by oath the promise he then made to me, I will give this land to your descendants. He will send his messenger before you. You will obtain a wife for my son there. If the woman is unwilling to follow you, you will be released from this oath. But never take my son back there! Exclamation. So the servant swore this, that he wasn't going to. Abraham is looking for a holy, God-fearing woman for his son. He does not want him to marry some like an Egyptian wife or somebody that they're gonna be back into the temptation to go live outside of God, and that's why that movie is good to watch, because it shows that the Egyptians really just all the Gentiles were worshiping, earthly things, like literally rocks and whatever other thing. And Abraham doesn't want that for Isaac. So the servant swears to Abraham, and the servant took 10 camels. He took camels, which is really like part of the gifts, but he also took a lot of other gifts. It's important to remember there was 10 camels. He went to the city of Nahor, which is a city named after his brother, Abraham's brother. He made the camels kneel outside by the well. So he sort of makes an ask from God here. He asks that he wants it to be revealed to him who the woman it is. He wants to have concrete knowledge of who it's going to be so that he doesn't have to sort of second guess, is this the right choice? So he let the woman be known, and he asked that she reveal himself if when he asked a drink from a girl that she would also feed his camels. This way he will know for sure. So he prays, Lord God of my master Abraham, let it turn out favorably for me today, and thus deal graciously with my master Abraham, while I stand here at the spring, and the daughters of the townsmen are coming out to draw water. If I say to a girl, please lower your jug that I may drink, and she answers, take a drink, and let me give your water to your camels too, let her be the one whom you have decided for your servant Isaac. In this way I shall know that you have dealt graciously with my master. It's just a way for him to know for sure that it's the right person. And it's also sort of like a way of finding a noble person who is generous and is going to be helpful. And that's who he's looking for. A woman with kind traits who is willing to serve him and the camels. And as we see, God has no problem answering this servant's ask here. Rebekah shortly comes out with a tub on her shoulder. It says she was beautiful. She was a virgin, so something that was high value at the time, and still is really. So she does exactly what the servant had asked God to do, and to be revealed. So he not only gives water to him, but she offers to have all the camels, to be able to feed all the camels water. Which 10 I don't know how much camels, I don't know how many gallons of water a camel can drink, but I'm sure it's a lot. So she's going back and forth with with all these jugs of water. And he's probably just watching this like wow, like she's doing exactly what I asked God to do, so that I would know for sure that she was the one. It's just a really cool story. So giving him the water, so she goes back, gives all the camels all the water. He's probably just watching this in awe. It happens exactly as he wanted it to. He starts putting gold on her. He puts a gold ring on her nose, gold bracelets that were like 10 shekels each, which I looked that up. It's basically about a quarter of a pound of gold for each brand. It's a hefty amount of gold. He asks whose daughter is she, and if he can spend the night. She answers she's the daughter of Bethuel, and yes, there is a place for him to spend the night. The servant then bows down and worships God. He's so happy that God answered his prayer, and it has again provided for Abraham. Abraham originally started this whole thing to find a wife for his son, so that the covenant can play out and that he can have more and more offspring from the promised son of Isaac. So he's just so happy, the servant, that it's working out for Abraham, and it's also working out well for himself. The girl ran off and told her mother about it. So Rebekah had this brother named Laban who is going to come up again. And he's an interesting guy. But when he saw the bracelets and heard about what happened, he rushed to the servant and asked, why are you staying outside when I have prepared my house for you? He's like all eager for the servant to come in, and he always has some type of ulterior motive or some kind of trick up his sleeve. And I'm sure he saw the gold and was like, oh, let me go make sure that this guy is squared away, because I want to get in. If this could be advantageous to me, with all this gold. I don't know, it's just a theory. But so anyways, they get him all into the house and everything, and he gets all settled in. And when the table was set for him and he's ready to sit down, he's like, I'm talking about the servant. He's like, I will not eat until I tell my tale. So he's got to say his piece and explain everything first before they indulge in this meal. But he tells them that he is Abraham's servant and that God has made him wealthy with flocks. God has made Abraham wealthy with flocks and herds and servants and gold and silver. He tells them about Sarah and how she was old and had this miracle happen with the birth of Isaac. And he tells them that he was entrusted with finding a woman who was not a Canaanite for his son, and that the Lord's messenger, who was always with Abraham, would also be with him as well. And then he basically tells him, kind of goes through the whole story again of the camels and everything. So he tells them how he did this ask of God, to be able, so that how it came to fruition that Rebekah came out and fed all 10 camels just as he wanted to happen, so that he would know that she was the right one. So Laban, who fits in very well with this whole family dynamic, says that if this comes from the Lord, then we couldn't do anything either way. So in that verse, I'll just read it, but Laban and his household said in reply, the thing that comes from the Lord, we can say nothing to you, either for or against it. So even if he's like, well, what would it matter, because it's coming from God? So yes, this is sure, you can absolutely have Rebekah for Isaac. And so he sort of offers up Rebekah here. Here is Rebekah ready for you. Take her with you, that she may become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has said. The servant bowed down to the ground in front, and basically just worshiping the Lord for this, because it basically became official and now his job was accomplished. And then he brought out silver and gold and started presenting them, and clothes, and started presenting them to Rebekah. He also gave these high value presents to Laban and her mother. And then now finally they celebrate by having this dinner. This is a really cool story. So they get up the next morning, and the servant's like, all right, Rebekah, it's time to go. And the family probably missing her already, even before she's gone. That's how it is when you have a family member that's leaving. They're like, well, can she stay for 10 days? Can she stay for 10 more days? Which is sweet when we think about kind of the gentle behavior that we see from the family of God. And I mean, this was so long ago. We're still in Genesis, and we see so much of these family dynamics and these things that are written about these people that we can relate to. I don't see any of that kind of, like, I don't see that sort of gentleness in this and these kind feelings and things, and just really the descriptive nature of how this stuff is written. I don't see that in any other ancient text. Um, and maybe it's out there, sure, but this is really, it's appealing to a lot of an emotional connection with this family of God. But anyways, so this servant is anxious to get her over there because his life depends on it. And they ask Rebekah what she wants to do. So I just want to point out that it's great that they get her involved in these decisions. She needs to make these decisions as well, and that's just another part of God's family and the kindness towards women that we see continually throughout throughout the scriptures. So she says, "I do." She's ready to go. They allow her to leave. They do a little blessing for her. Essentially, it just says in the ESV, and this is Genesis 24, verse 60. Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him. So essentially, this is sort of like adding her to the covenant of Abraham, in that her descendants are going to grow and grow and grow, and those descendants are going to control the gate of the enemies, basically saying like they're going to be in control over those enemies. So it's just a really cool little blessing that is said over her. And then she takes her nurse and all and her maids, and they go back. They head back to Isaac. And meanwhile, so Isaac at this time was living in Beer Laharoy. He was out in the field when they're coming back, and he saw the camels. Rebekah also saw him and asked the servant, who is that? Is that my husband? And the servant told her, yes, it's Isaac, and it's the one that she's to marry. And so she takes down her veil to reveal herself. And the servant told Isaac everything that happened. Isaac was probably pretty giddy about all this. And so anyways, Isaac, they meet. I'm sure this was a really cool romantic scene, and Isaac took her in the tent, and they get married, and she became his wife. So it was just a good moment. Yay. And then it says he loved her and found solace, after the death of her mother. So after the death of his mother. So he, probably in a dark place with the death of Sarah, and now he has something to be happy over. Okay, so that was chapter 24. Going into chapter 25, we see here that Abraham is very active, even after Sarah in his old age. He ain't done yet. He remarries this other wife named Keturah. But something that happens is he also gets concubines. And, this is sort of the Hagar situation all over again, which is pretty much what concubines are, is just like this polygamous relationship, where you'd have like a wife and then like some servant girls under her. And it's something that like we'll see this happen throughout, but kings will do this. They'll have hundreds of concubines. And this is, unfortunately it's not going away, but just because we see this in the Bible, it doesn't mean it's a good thing. Doesn't mean that it's God's design. God allows all kinds of things to happen, but it doesn't have anything really to do with God or his will, or what we are commanded from God. There's several examples of this. One of the examples we talked about earlier, Noah and the curse, in his curse of Canaan, and what is happening here is that men are enforcing this curse, right? So even though God is allowing it to happen, but essentially, he's not directly allowing anything, or he's not directly enacting anything. He has to allow things to happen due to free will, but it doesn't have anything to do with God or God's will or God's plan. So these concubines, and having them be, servant girls who are sort of just kind of a reproductive placeholder, sort of. It's interesting. There's a parallel there, I think, with an aspect of slavery. But these men who enforce this, and going back to Noah and the curse, and men enforce that, right? And they are the ones that, when they let go of that curse and they forgive, they are actually breaking free of their own bondage, and they have this bondage. These slave holders and all these other men in power and things, they are actually the ones in bondage. And when they forgive, and when they see past these curses and these things, that's actually them breaking free of their bondage. It's really interesting that we think that the slaves are the ones in bondage, but really the slave masters are sort of bound to their own pride. And what does God's what does Jesus say is the greatest among you will serve the other. So just multiple things in here. We talked a lot about it: concubines, slavery. There's a lot of things in this Bible that are in here, but it does not mean that it's God's design in any form or fashion. And it's just something that man has created, and now it creates problems. These concubines, the owning a bunch of concubines is very much like a king type of behavior. And not that Abraham's a king, but any like men in high positions of power would do this. And out of these people that are born from Abraham, there's not really any major highlights, unless I'm missing something. I mean, you do have the Midian, or you have Midian, and then the Midianites who come from that. The Midianites are going to have sort of this back and forth relationship with the Israelites, but they are sort of excluded from the family of God in the Old Testament. But essentially, you have Isaac, and then you have all his other sons, and he gave everything to Isaac. He gave gifts, or he gave like everything that he owned to Isaac, but he gave some small gifts to the sons of the concubine. So, I mean, you can kind of think about it like a party favor. And it says that his sons went east. So Abraham, this is the death of Abraham here. He dies at 175 years old. Remember, 175 years is not crazy, considering that God had created the universe. At first, we were living in God's presence in the Garden of Eden, and God had created this atmosphere that was very conducive to life. And then once Adam and Eve broke out of that, and basically God's presence no longer exists on earth in a way that is allowing humans to live as long as they did. So before, God was very much had very much created an atmosphere that allowed for an eternal life, or created a garden that allowed for that. And since then, it's sort of been slowly fading away, which makes complete sense. This physical atmosphere, I'm talking about the actual atmosphere, had once been what was once able to really uphold life and make it last, and it was very conducive to life. Well, now it's slowly becoming polluted, and God is no longer holding that together. So we see like humans living less and less over the year, or less and less time, or their life expectancy starts going down when we have Adam and Methuselah and these guys who lived to almost 1,000 years old. And now we're down to people living, 175 sounds like a long time, but these people were at one time living a lot longer. But it's still pretty early in the Bible. I mean, we're in Genesis, so Abraham is still very much living a longer than most people, due to still living closer to the presence of God. So it says in verse 8 here that he breathed his last, dying at a ripe old age, grown old after a full life. So he had a full life. The story of Abraham. I mean, we've been talking about Abraham for a long time now, probably close to 3 or 4 hours. But he's one of the big patriarchs of Genesis, and there's a lot of patriarchs in the Bible, but this is a key focus of the beginning of the Bible, are these patriarchs. And Abraham is probably, I would say, easily one of the most important ones. And it's just because you have so many, even now, like, you have so many different religions tied to him, so many different splinters of Islam, and a lot of different sects of whatever other thing. You have a lot of different Jewish cultures, and all these people, though, the one thing they have in common is Abraham. Okay, so Abraham is taken to his kinsmen. Isaac and Ishmael reunite to bury him in the cave of Machpelah. He's buried with Sarah in the land he purchased. I would imagine he had passed down this land to Isaac so that Isaac would own it as well. Pretty sure we'll read about that later. But another reason he purchased, or we'll read about Isaac using that burial ground again for his wife as well. But I think that's in there. I don't know. We haven't gotten to it yet. Another reason he had purchased it in this thing, or the land that we talked about earlier, this thing is going to grow and grow. So it's good that he did that, and that it would be kept sacred, because now we're seeing like it is getting used. It says that God blessed Isaac, and that he made his home near Beer-lahai. And then it goes through the descendants of Ishmael. I don't really recognize any names here with Ishmael. I will say that one thing to note out of here is there are 12 princes, like 12 sons, just like we'll see in a second with Jacob. But there are 12 princes, just as God had promised. So God's, he sticks to his promises, and Ishmael here, really reaps the benefit of being a part of God. Ishmael dies, and he had lived to be 137. They talk about the land that Ishmael had sort of taken over, which reigns from Havilah by Shur, which is the border of Egypt, to Ashur. And then it says here, pretty key part, but he lived in opposition, meaning he lived as an enemy to everyone, which is exactly like the fulfillment of the prophecy. And it's even still very much true today, that we see the people who descended from the Ishmaelites, or the culture the religion that descended from the Ishmaelites, are still in a sort of a constant state of war in a lot of ways. You just look at the Middle East, and it's been that way since this time. So it's just a fulfillment of that prophecy. So, okay, now we're going to get into the new patriarch, um, and we are going to talk about the birth of Esau and Jacob. So Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Isaac prayed to God to have a child with her. She had a challenge to become pregnant. And we will find out that this challenge was about 20 years. This is something that a lot of people resonate with. We already saw that with Sarah, but there are a lot of people, I personally have prayed for someone to become, for friends to have pregnancies. I myself am a child that um, was born out of out of somebody praying for me. I know mom and dad, y'all are watching, but hi guys. But my mom and dad prayed for me for a long time so that I would be born. So this is something that a lot of people resonate with, and is this struggle to have children. So Isaac, very much like his dad, and what Sarah and Rebecca, being a lot like what Sarah had went through, they have to pray to make this thing happen. And she becomes pregnant. So it does take 20 years, and you cannot put a time limit on God. And people sometimes, it's easy to get frustrated, and we pray for something for maybe 1 or 2 years, and then we stop because we just think it's not working. Well, it took 20 years. And you know, we've prayed for friends that, we prayed for 5 years for someone, like I said earlier, and every night praying, and then God answered that prayer, and you just see that there is no time limit, and you can't rush God, and God does things for reasons, and you just have to trust and know that just because something's taken a long time, it doesn't mean anything bad. It's just that is God's plan, and we need to know that it's His plan. It's not our plan. But we still need to pray for those things, and it's just a beautiful thing here that that happens for both Abraham and Isaac with their wives, that God chose for them, really. And it's just great to see that Abraham and Isaac both have this prayer answered. But so there's so you have Rebecca, who gets pregnant with these twins. So not only does God answer this prayer, but there's twins. Not with just one child. He doesn't answer the prayer with just one child, but he answers it with a set of twins. And we'll go ahead and read it, but they start off fighting in the womb. But the children in her womb jostled each other so much that she exclaimed, "If this is to be so, what good will it do me?" So she's like, what is it good is it going to do if these kids are just fighting to death? So she consulted with the Lord, which is really cool to see her go to God here. And he answered her. He said, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples are quarreling while still within you, but one shall surpass the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And this is that part of God that just goes against the grain. And it's just a continual thing in the Bible, but it's along the same verbiage, talking about, but one shall surpass the other, the older shall serve the younger. It's very much along that same verbiage that that's in the New Testament. The meek will inherit the earth. The greatest among you will serve the other. And usually the firstborn was just sort of blindly assumed to be the heir by virtue and this privilege that was really only there by chance, and never, didn't necessarily earn anything. But that's not God's will necessarily. And God's will needs to be considered when handing down any power. And we see this eventually we'll see this with the kings, who just sort of give the firstborn the throne, Well, that firstborn could have some terrible intentions. I mean, they could be very much going against God. And so to give them that throne means you're giving somebody a position of power, and they're not going to know, or they're not going to do the right thing in that power. And he's sort of getting rid of um, this blind, just handing down power to the firstborn, going against the grain and doing the thing that is going to be the most logical thing. And because God knows that Jacob is more well suited to carry down the covenant and be the next big patriarch as opposed to Esau. And it's interesting that this is going to be a sign to come, that just because they have someone were to have many sons, picking a leader is not just about just picking the firstborn. So it might be a sign to Jacob that he will remember that he needs to make a wise choice and use logic and reason and not just go by who was first. And we'll see that with Jacob and his relationship with Joseph. But so we read about Esau. He was born first. He was born very reddish, it says, and very hairy. Like almost like an X-Men, I guess, I would imagine. Like I don't like some type of mutant hairy red thing. I don't know. But his brother came out gripping his heel. So I think his brother was trying to get first, right? Like, let me pass somebody up. And his brother was like that. And it's interesting that it says he was gripping his heel. So they named him Jacob. So, and Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. Esau became a skillful hunter. He lived in the open, so he just kind of lived outdoors. Jacob was a simple man. He more lived inside in the tents. Isaac preferred Esau. And, you have to think that Rebekah told him about this, and Isaac sort of like told him about Jacob being the next, or that Esau were to serve Jacob. So you would think that Rebekah would tell Isaac, but Isaac's sort of ignoring that. And I guess Isaac preferred Esau because it says that Esau would bring Isaac like good food after he'd make a big kill or something, and I guess make him barbecue. Like, I mean, I guess that is a way to get your father's approval. But they play favorites here, right? It's not really a good thing that's happening. Rebekah preferred Jacob more, and you have to think, I guess that's because of what was told to her by God. But they're just kind of doing this and see, like, one is doing one thing and the other is doing another, and they're kind of playing favorites. You have Rebekah and Jacob and Isaac and Esau, and they're not like a structure. They're not like a together family unit right now. So anyways, one day Jacob was cooking a stew, and Esau came in and was very tired and needed food. It says, he was like just starving. It's the way that it's put here is just very, the way it's written. He says, let me gulp down some of that red stuff. Like word for word, that's what my Bible says. Let me gulp down some of that red stuff. That's how I imagine he would say that. I just think it's funny it's written like that. Which he's being so dramatic here. He's not gonna die. He's not actually dying. I mean, there's all kind of people around him. He has his mom, his dad. Like, he wouldn't actually die, but he's kind of acting like he is going to. So Jacob's like, sure, you can have this stew, this red stuff, this stew. Jacob's like, okay, give me your birthright. He's negotiating for it. He's trying to get something out of this. He's getting a really good exchange. And and Esau, who's like, well, what good is my birthright if I die? I'm on the point of dying. What good will any birthright do me? Which is just so dramatic from Esau here. Like, come on, man. Like, you're not dying. But so he does it. And Jacob makes him swear to him. He says, swear to me first. So Jacob, he's a trickster. We'll read more about it, but man, he's doing, he's relying on his tricks here to get this birthright. And so Jacob makes him swear in the whole 9 yards, and you could just tell that Esau doesn't really care about his birthright. It even specifies that in here. It says, Jacob gave him some bread. Jacob then gave him some bread and lentil stew, and Esau ate and drank, got up, and went his way. Esau cared very little about his birthright. And it's mentioned in Hebrews, this Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15 through 16, and it's sort of making a comparison between, I think this is, what this verse is saying about sexual immorality with Esau is sort of going for the quick and easy thing as opposed to what's best for your future. So you're sort of attracted to this, instant gratification or this instant fulfillment of lust or whatever desire, hunger that you have, instead of being able to suppress that and keep yourself holy and keep yourself and keep yourself best set up for the future, and for the future kingdom of Christ. Really, you can make that comparison, but Esau in the same way is not doing what's best for his future. He's just doing the best for right now, which is this bowl of stew. That was chapter 25. Now let's get in chapter 26. So there was this famine in the land, and it was different than the previous one that we had talked about. Remember, these famines are a big deal. Isaac went down to Abimelech, and God here reminds Isaac of the covenant he made with Abraham, in basically going through again, the descendants will be as numerous as the stars. But this is something that God did a pretty good job of, like, continually reminding Abraham of this covenant. And now he's doing the same thing with with Isaac, in that he is continually reminding Isaac about this covenant. So it's good. It's good that he's doing this. He does not want Isaac to go back to Egypt the same way that Abraham did not want a different wife from a different place. But in the same way, so do not go down to Egypt. And it's interesting. I have to shout out to Tyler Moffitt at Grace Fellowship, which is my church and my pastor. He's one of the biggest things I learned from him in the Old Testament is throughout the Old Testament, we see this, especially in the first two books in Exodus as well, but we see this tendency for the Israelites and these early patriarchs to want to go back to Egypt. And really what that is trying to say is, or what this is saying, is going back to sin. So in the same way, we think to ourselves that we don't want to go back to Egypt. We don't want to go and do the easy thing, even though there's all these whatever they have there, that it seems like it's an attraction. We don't want to do that. We want to rely on God. So shout out Tyler if you're watching. Okay, so Isaac settled in Gerar, and here we go again. He's pulling out the good old, she's my sister trick that we already talked about in length at the beginning of this podcast. And he, just like Abraham, thought that these men would kill her. And maybe there was something going on where it was just a common thing that these Hittites or whoever would just kill these guys and take their wives. I would only assume, because I don't know why Isaac is now doing this. But apparently he does it. Does the trick. They they assume that Isaac or Rebekah is his sister, but then they see Abimelech saw Isaac and Rebekah doing some PDA, some kind of public display of affection, which sets Abimelech ablaze. He's like, "How could you have said she is my sister?" You, you know, he's pretty mad about it, just like the other Abimelech. These are two different Abimelechs, from what I understand, and that's why I said earlier, Abimelech is just the generic name for the king of that in that time, for whether it was the Hittites or whatever group of people. But so Abimelech scolds him, and it's almost comical at this point for me, because right after this, so first off, Abimelech says, like, he gives a warning to all of his men: anyone who touches this man or his wife shall be put to death. So, like, he's not playing. He already knows. He must have got the information from the former Abimelech that he needs to fear God, and he's not going to play around with taking Isaac's wife. So, Isaac again just didn't have faith that those people were not going to harm him, and we have to wonder where that comes from, whether they really were that violent or what. But obviously Abimelech himself, or there were people that did fear God there, because again, he's very much adamant about protecting Isaac and his wife. So, but anyways, what happened shortly after this? Isaac gets blessed. So every single time that this trick is brought out, somebody's getting blessed, whether it's Abraham or Isaac. And it says that his crops and everything reaped 100-fold in the same year. 100-fold. That's crazy. That's 100 times more than normal. So that is like a major blessing. He says he became richer all the time. He acquired so much flocks and herds that these Philistines had become envious of him. And naturally they did, right? They had become envious. They were even running these like ops, like that they were, ops running ops. But they were sabotaging his wells. Remember, the control over water was a big thing. Abimelech said that he just needed to go away. He was far too numerous. And Isaac reopened the wells because it was done by his father, and he wanted access to that water. So he gave them the same names, those wells that Abraham had named them. Remember, they closed them. I think that the Philistines, I think they closed down these other sources of water so that they can control the water, so that they could, overcharge people for the water and sort of create this monopoly on water, and probably enslave people. And really, there's like price gouging the water. It's just a theory, but controlling the water obviously is something they wanted. So if you had a well of water, it was very powerful, and it was, it gave life. And we talked about that earlier. But after Isaac's servants dug them up, the shepherds of Gerar had quarreled with Isaac, saying that it belonged to them. So even after Isaac made them appear, they started fighting about it. These wells were called Esek and Sitnah, which Esek means dispute, Sitnah means challenge, or I've also seen it mean hate, due to this quarreling. They didn't, however. Well, by the time they got to the one that opened up at Rehoboth, then they probably had so much water at this point that they didn't really need a quarrel anymore. I guess they started realizing, like, oh, well, I guess the more the merrier for everyone. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. So Isaac went to Beersheba. Um, the covenant is again reminded here. And God is continually with his family, and he's continually comforting them. And it's really good that God does this, because they do need a constant comfort and constant reminder about this covenant that is very important. And it's easy to lose sight on that, but God does a great job of continually reminding. It says, from there, Isaac went up to Beersheba. The same night, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. You have no need to fear, since I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. So he built an altar there and invoked the Lord by name. After he had pitched his tent there, his servants began to dig a well nearby. So then we see another peace making by Abimelech. Abimelech really wants there to be peace, and it says that, we are convinced that the Lord is with you. So seeing that God is with them, Abimelech doesn't want to go against God. He's smarter than that, and they want to have this peace. It's a very comforting passage, just in general. Things are good right now for all of them, really, because of all the water, and these blessings, and this feud that existed, and now it seems to have been put away by Abimelech, and by Isaac, and so Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning, they exchanged oaths. Then Isaac bade them farewell, and they departed from him in peace. So really cool that these wells of water have just been really great sources of inspiration for these covenants of peace to happen between these two groups of people who are, very different people, but they can still make a covenant of peace. And so it says here, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, who was a Hittite, something you were not supposed to do, something his parents did not like at all. It said it was a source of embitterment to Isaac and Rebekah. So that is going to be all of chapter 26. We end with Esau kind of doing a bad thing, and we understand why God had made that proclamation to Rebekah that Isaac was going to be the one that would it. He didn't say that directly, but it does. That is what it means: is that Isaac is going to be next in line to inherit the birthright and on the blessing and everything. So now we get into a pretty well-known chapter. So chapter 27, Isaac is getting older. His eyesight is failing him. He can't see as well anymore. He calls in Esau and says, he says, like, I'm dying pretty much. I'm so old now. As you can see, I'm so old that I may die at any time. Take your gear, therefore, your quiver and bow, and go out into the country to hunt some game for me. With your catch, prepare an appetizing dish for me, and bring it to me to eat, so that I can give you my special blessing before I die. Which is so dramatic. Isaac is right here, just like Esau was. Rebecca's probably in the background. If she did hear that, she's probably like rolling her eyes, like, oh my god. In reality, they sort of, I think they're doing this in private between Rebecca, and I don't think he's letting Rebecca know about this. It's not like this family event, right? I'm trying to give Esau the blessing in private, even though it's going against God and it's going against my wife's concerns. And um, so Rebekah does hear this though, and sorry if I was confusing you guys, but she does definitely hear this, and so Rebekah hears this, and it's almost this chapter reads just like a TV drama or something out of a sitcom. I mean, it is like a sitcom, and she tells Isaac everything about giving Esau the birthright, and notice Esau was very quiet about it, not mentioning that he had given up his birthright already for a pot of stew. He very much kept that under wraps. But and she tells Jacob this plan, and she tells Jacob this plan about giving him the birthright, or giving Esau the birthright, and this probably gets Jacob all fired up, because he wasn't, Jacob had already sort of conned Esau into getting it. So there's probably a lot of whispering and scheming, I would imagine, in this whole little debacle of a chapter. But Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Listen, I overheard your father tell your brother Esau, kind of goes through the whole thing. Now, son, listen carefully to what I tell you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids. With these, I will prepare an appetizing dish for your father, such as he likes, and then bring it to your father to eat, so that he blesses you before he dies." Another thing is, like, Isaac does live for a lot longer after this. So, I mean, I say a lot longer. I think it's like 30 or 40 years. So he is kind of rushing the birthright. I think he's just trying to get it done. So, but this raises a lot of questions, like, why wasn't this ever brought up? Number one, to God. Why wasn't God consulted by Isaac, or why didn't Rebekah go to God? It's just something that's done outside of God. But she goes to the point of, Jacob's sort of worried, like, what if something happens? And she even says, like, I'll take the blame, because Jacob was afraid of getting cursed through all this. So Jacob did just as his mom told him to do, and that was, he makes this appetizing dish for his father, and then from the skins of the lambs that were prepared, they take that and they put it on Jacob. Like, I mean, there's the craziest, most sitcom type stuff. Says that Rebekah also made some bread, for Isaac, and then Jacob goes in and says to his father, "Father," and Isaac, can't see, but he's like, that didn't sound like Esau. He says, "Which one of my sons are you?" And that's, why would he say that if he knew, right? And so he kind of, I think he's starting to suspect something. And Jacob lies right here. Like, I mean, he says, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I did as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your special blessing." And but Isaac's like, he's a little smarter than that. He's like, "Well, how did you do that so quickly?" Because Esau was supposed to go find some animal. Well, they had already had it ready, so there wasn't like a lot of time wasted. But they're trying to do this fast before Esau gets back. So he's like, "How did that happen so quickly?" And Jacobs goes, "The Lord your God let things turn out well with me." Like, that's not good to lie and bring God into this now. Isaac then said, "Okay, come closer to let me feel you," because he really didn't trust him. whether you're my son or not. And Jacob moved closer, and Jacob's probably like, oh, I hope this is working. And when Isaac felt him, he said, although the voice is Jacob's, the hands are Esau. So he knows that this is Jacob's voice. And he had to ask him again, are you really my son Esau? Certainly. He's like really selling, Jacob is really selling this now. He's like, yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's definitely me. I would imagine maybe that this is just a theory, but I bet Jacob had like the food like there, and I could just imagine like Isaac smelling it, like, are you sure this is Jacob? Or are you sure this is Esau? Certainly. And Isaac's like, okay, like just ready to eat that food. He's just like a sucker for some good, game or meat or whatever. So Isaac just buys into this thing. They're really selling it hard, and Isaac's just buying into it. This is an interesting thing about this passage is it just shows that Jacob does, and I see obviously he's doing something wrong here. He's lying, he's deceiving, but he does want this more than Esau. No doubt about that. And like my dad always said, the squeakiest wheel gets the grease, and that is true. And even God knows that, I think. And that's why he was picked originally. So I think there is something about wanting it more and just showing more heart to have this thing. They do this Tom Brady-esque kiss moment where he kisses his son and does this special blessing. Sorry, that was... the fragrance of my son is like the fragrance of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give to you of the dew of the heavens and of the fertility of the earth, abundance of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations pay you homage. Be masters of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you. Which we did see that already said to Abraham. So it's just like a further of, it's a blessing continued on to the next. So now Esau comes back with the dish, right? And everything's about to unravel. But this blessing that I just read has already been done. Isaac was seized with a fit of uncontrollable trembling. So, I need to clarify that. But Isaac is mad because he'd sort of been duped, and now this lie has been learned, because Esau comes back and he's like, "Hey, it's me. It's your firstborn. I have this stuff." And Isaac's like, "What?" And so he starts like shaking. It was all a ruse. And Esau gets mad. Isaac goes on to tell Esau, like, who was it then, he asked, that hunted game and brought it to me? I just finished it before you came, and I blessed him. Now he must remain blessed. That part is, I guess, odd to me, but once you said something or did something, in that time and day, like that time period, it was it. They're just words, but it was already done. And so he tries to ask, Esau tries to ask Isaac if he can redo it, and he can't, because, this is a covenant type of a promise that Isaac made to Jacob. And we think about the same way the covenant that happened with Abraham and the animal sacrifice, when he walked through all those animals split in half. There was no undoing that. And there is no undoing this. This is a covenant that was, this was a promise that was made from Isaac to Jacob, and you can't go back on your promises. Just like God doesn't go back on his promises, we don't go back on our promises. So I think so Isaac here sort of makes peace with this whole thing after Esau sort of continually goes back and forth with him. Have you that one only blessing, Father, bless me too. And it's probably really sad. And yeah, I kind of feel bad for Esau a little bit, but at the same time, he didn't ever really want this thing. If he did, it's only out of convenience. And Esau wept loud, and Isaac finally sort of accepts this. For far from the fertile earth shall be your dwelling, far from the dew of the heavens above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. Basically fulfilling what God had said. So Isaac is now accepting this, and he is proclaiming that, yes, that is going to be the case, Esau. You're going to serve your brother, and it's just something you need to deal with. But when you become restive, you shall throw off his yoke from your neck. So that is, it actually is a kind of a peaceful way to end. I know it doesn't seem that way immediately for Esau, but and when you become restive, you shall throw off his yoke from your neck. So I think what that's saying is like when you accept it as well, then you can move on from it. And Esau goes into this like Cain and Abel type rage, and we talked about that in episode 2, I think it was, but and he wants to kill Jacob. I mean, he's mad about this. Rebekah told Jacob to leave because Esau wants to kill him, and he told him to go to live with Laban, Laban to go stay with him until Esau's anger goes down. And Rebekah had another reason for sending him to Laban, which was that she would be angered if both of her sons ended up with Hittite women. So these Hittites were godless people. So this is another reason that that Rebekah sends Rebekah sends Jacob to go live with Laban, which these two deserve each other, which we'll read about in a little bit. Jacob and Laban, they're just like, it's a real funny thing that happens. Man, I love this Bible. I love these stories. There's such good stories, and there's nothing like these stories. I mean, there's just really cool things that happen, and especially in Genesis, we get a lot of fun things. But that's it, guys. That was chapter 27. So very long podcast. I really, really appreciate you guys getting on with me. So next week, we are going to do chapters 28 through, I think we'll do like chapters 28 through 36. Yeah. So next week, Genesis, go ahead before the next podcast. You can read Genesis chapters 28 through 36. Thank you guys so much for getting on with me. I love you guys. If you want to be on the podcast, send me an email. It's PODigalSons777 or drop a comment, or if you have my phone number, give me a call or text me. But look forward to next week, and thank you guys for getting on. Bye.